He said, "I gave your PS5 to my nephew. You're 32. Stop playing video games." It was a limited edition worth $2,000 that I had saved for months to buy. I said, "Kids should have fun." Then I sold his MacBook Pro on Facebook Marketplace for $200 and donated the money to charity. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 32 when I learned that disrespect does not always arrive as shouting. Sometimes it walks into your home wearing a calm face, touches something you love, and decides it has more right to it than you do. Mason and I had been together for about 14 months when everything fell apart. We moved in together 6 months before it happened, though technically he moved into my apartment. My name was on the lease. It had been my place for 3 years before Mason brought in his clothes, his coffee machine, his shoes by the door, and that quiet confidence men sometimes have when they start treating your space like it became theirs the second they entered it. At first, I liked it. I liked waking up to another toothbrush beside mine. I liked hearing him move around the kitchen in the morning. I like the small domestic things that make you believe a relationship is becoming permanent. I paid 60% of the rent because I made more. Mason covered utilities and groceries. It seemed fair at the time. It seemed like a partnership. That word matters later. I worked as a network administrator for a mid-sized company. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady. Benefits, decent paycheck, enough structure to make my life feel predictable. I drove an old Honda Civic with more miles on it than some people put on their dreams. I bought clothes only when something ripped badly enough that I could no longer pretend it was still fine. My idea of a fancy dinner was adding guacamole at Chipotle and not checking my bank app afterward. I was not someone who spent money carelessly, but I had one thing I loved: gaming. Not in the obsessive way people like Mason accuse me of. I played maybe 8 or 10 hours a week, a couple of hours after work when the day had been too loud. Sometimes on weekend mornings while Mason slept until noon and I sat quietly in the living room with coffee beside me, headset on, talking to friends from college who now lived in different states. Every Wednesday night, we played together online. 6 years of that. People grow up, move away, get married, have kids, change jobs, disappear into their own lives. But on Wednesday nights, for a few hours, we were still there, laughing, teasing, losing badly, remembering versions of ourselves we did not get to be every day. That was my thing. Everyone has a thing. Mason never understood mine. In the beginning, his comments were small enough that I told myself they did not matter. "Aren't you a little old for video games?" My ex, Lena, never really played games. She was more into hiking and real hobbies. "I just think it's weird when my friends ask what you're doing, and I have to say you're gaming." He always said it lightly, almost joking. The kind of tone that gives the other person nowhere to put their hurt without sounding dramatic. So I laughed it off. I told myself relationships required compromise. Mason had things I did not understand either. He spent money on sneakers he never wore outside because he did not want to crease them. He watched sports commentary for hours about games that had already ended. He bought expensive grooming products that all looked like the same bottle with a different label. I never mocked him for it. I never threw out his shoes because I thought he had too many. I never told him he was too old to care about athletes who did not know he existed. I thought that was what love meant. You did not have to understand every part of someone to respect that it belonged to them. Last year, I decided to treat myself. There was a limited edition PS5 being released with a special anniversary color scheme. A custom controller, collector packaging, the whole thing. Only 12,000 units were made worldwide. Retail price was $699, but resale values were already climbing over $2,000 because collectors were going feral for it. I entered a lottery through a major retailer, expecting nothing. Then I won. I still remember staring at the email like it might vanish if I blinked too hard. I saved for 4 months to buy it comfortably. Packed lunches instead of ordering food at work. Cut my streaming services down to 1. Skipped nights out with friends. Not because I could not technically afford it, but because I wanted to buy it without guilt. I wanted it to feel earned. When the box arrived, I stood in my living room like a child on Christmas morning. I took photos of the unboxing. I saved the packaging. I placed it carefully in my entertainment center like it was art. Mason watched from the couch with that half smile I had started to hate. "Congratulations," he said. "You bought a very expensive toy." I should have heard the warning in that sentence. 2 weeks before everything happened, Mason's older sister came over for the weekend with her 11-year-old son, Noah. Noah was a decent kid, a little spoiled maybe, the way kids become when every adult around them mistakes wanting something for needing it. But he was not cruel. He was just loud, restless, and easily amazed. The second he saw my PS5 setup, his whole face changed. "Is that the limited one?" he asked. I was surprised he even knew. I smiled and said, "Yeah, you want to try it?" He looked at Mason first, then at his mother, then back at me, like I had offered him the keys to a sports car. I let him play for about an hour. I sat beside him, showed him age-appropriate games, explained the controller, helped him through a level when he got stuck. He was thrilled, and honestly, I liked seeing that. Sharing something you love with someone excited about it can make the thing feel new again. Mason stood in the doorway for part of it, arms folded, watching. At the time, I thought he was amused. Now I think he was calculating. When his sister and Noah left Sunday evening, Noah kept looking back at the entertainment center. His mother had to call his name twice before he followed her out. Mason laughed after the door closed. "That kid is obsessed." I said, "He's 11. Everything is the best thing ever for 5 minutes." Mason looked at the console, then at me. "You really don't use it that much anyway." I paused. "What?" He shrugged. "I'm just saying, for something that expensive, it mostly sits there." I should have answered. I should have asked him why he cared. I should have noticed how casually he was already separating me from something that belonged to me. But I was tired, and the comment felt like one more tiny pebble in a pile I had been pretending was not becoming heavy. So I let it go. The following Saturday, I came home from a half day at work and knew something was wrong before I even set my bag down. The living room looked almost the same. Almost. The entertainment center had that strange, empty shape people notice when something familiar has been removed. My game cases were still lined up neatly. The cables were tucked behind the shelf. The small framed photo beside the TV was still there. But the PS5 was gone. The custom controller was gone. For one stupid second, my brain refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. Then my heart started pounding. I checked the floor, the cabinet, behind the television. I walked through the apartment looking for anything else missing. My first real thought was that we had been robbed. I checked the windows for broken glass, looked at the front door, reached for my phone, ready to call the police. That was when Mason came out of the bedroom. I was scrolling through his phone, completely calm. I said, "Mason, someone took my PS5. I think we need to call the police." He barely looked up. "Oh, yeah, no, I gave that to Noah." The room went still. I stared at him. "You what?" He finally looked at me then. Not guilty, not nervous, not even careful. I gave it to him. He couldn't stop talking about it after he visited. My sister said he's been struggling in school lately. Bad grades, no motivation. I figured the PlayStation could be a reward system. You know, good grades, he gets to play. It'll be good for him. I could hear him speaking. I understood every word, but none of it made sense in my body. "You gave my $2,000 console to your nephew to motivate him to do homework?" Mason sighed like I was already disappointing him. "It's not worth $2,000. Don't be dramatic. It's a video game machine." Then he said the sentence that ended us before either of us admitted it. "And honestly, Alara, you're 32. You really shouldn't be spending that much time on games anyway." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. Not because the words were complicated, because they were too simple. Sometimes the worst betrayals are not dramatic. There is no shouting, no slamming doors, no confession that changes everything in a single second. Sometimes someone looks directly at you and calmly explains why they were entitled to cross a line you never imagined they would touch. Mason stood there holding his phone like we were discussing grocery lists, instead of the fact that he had given away something that belonged to me, something I had worked for, something I had chosen, something that was mine. I looked at him and suddenly found myself remembering dozens of conversations I had dismissed over the last year. The jokes, the comments, the eye rolls, the way he always smiled after criticizing my hobby, as if the smile erased the criticism. The way he compared me to Lena. The way he never said, "I respect it even if I don't understand it." Instead, he always acted like my interests were temporary flaws I would eventually outgrow. At the time, I called those moments differences. Standing in that living room, staring at the empty space where my PS5 had been, I realized they were warnings. The truth is that people rarely wake up one morning and decide to disrespect you. They practice, a little at a time. A joke here, a dismissal there. A criticism disguised as concern. And if nobody stops them, eventually they become comfortable deciding what should matter to you. Mason was still talking. The point is you're being selfish. Selfish. The word landed strangely. I had spent months saving for that console. I had paid for it myself. I had never stopped him from buying anything he wanted. Yet somehow I was selfish because I expected ownership over my own belongings. My nephew is a child, he continued. He actually needs encouragement and motivation. You're an adult. You don't need a PlayStation. I stared at him. What struck me wasn't the argument. It was the certainty. There was no hesitation in his voice. No awareness that he might have crossed a line. No apology. No guilt. Nothing. I genuinely believed he had done the right thing. And somehow that hurt more than if he had done it out of spite. Because spite is emotional. This was something colder. This was judgment. Mason had looked at something I loved and decided his opinion carried more weight than my ownership. That realization settled into me slowly, like cold water rising around your feet before you realize you're standing in it. I took a breath, then another. I could feel anger trying to pull me somewhere reckless. But underneath the anger was something else. Disappointment. Real disappointment is quiet. People imagine heartbreak as explosions. In reality, heartbreak often sounds like silence. The moment you stop arguing, because a part of you understands the person standing in front of you is not who you thought they were. I looked at him and smiled, not because I was okay, because I wasn't, not even close, but because I suddenly understood there was no point trying to explain myself. You know what? I said softly. His shoulders relaxed immediately. The relief on his face was almost insulting. Kids should have fun. Mason smiled. A genuine smile. The kind people wear when they think they've won. Exactly. I nodded. I get it. I knew you would eventually. He sounded proud of himself. Like he'd guided me toward wisdom. Like I was the unreasonable one who finally came to her senses. It's just stuff, he said. Family is more important. I looked at him for a second. Then I smiled again. You're right. The conversation ended there. At least for him. For me, it had only just begun. That night I went to bed early. Mason seemed pleased about that too, as if acceptance looked exactly the way he expected it to look. But I didn't sleep. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet. Cars passed occasionally outside. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Mason was asleep beside me. And for hours I simply thought about the relationship, about respect, about the strange ways people reveal themselves. One realization kept returning no matter how many times I tried to move away from it. If he had accidentally damaged the console, I could have forgiven that. If he had loaned it to his nephew for a weekend and apologized afterward, maybe I could have forgiven that too. But he had done something worse. He had decided. Alone. Without consulting me. Without considering me. Without respecting me. And afterward he told me it was good for me. That was the part I could not get past. If Mason had apologized, maybe things would have been different. If he'd admitted he crossed a line, maybe we still would have had a chance. But every conversation somehow came back to why he thought he was right. What destroyed us was his belief that his judgment mattered more than my autonomy. Around midnight, I found myself thinking about something my father used to say. Never trust people who constantly explain why they're helping you. At the time, I thought it was cynical. Now I understood. Real help usually begins with a question, not a decision. The next morning was Sunday. Mason left around 10 for brunch with his sister, a weekly tradition. I knew their routine well. Coffee, breakfast, shopping afterward. At least 3 hours, sometimes 4. I sat alone in the apartment after he left. The empty entertainment center stared back at me. I made coffee, tried watching television, couldn't focus, walked around the apartment, couldn't settle. The anger wasn't getting smaller. It was getting clearer. There is a difference. Raw anger burns hot. Clear anger becomes direction. Around 11, I walked into the kitchen. His MacBook Pro was sitting exactly where he always left it. Silver, pristine, expensive. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I picked it up. Before all of this, I thought revenge would feel dramatic. It didn't. It felt surprisingly calm. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't even particularly emotional anymore. I was calm. And that calm scared me more than the anger ever had, because anger passes. Calm decisions stay. I carried the laptop to the dining table, opened it, verified it wasn't locked in a way that would prevent resale, checked the condition, took photos from every angle, documented everything. Part of me still expected guilt to arrive. It didn't. Instead, a different thought appeared, a simple one. If someone believes they have the right to decide what belongs to you, eventually they need to experience what that feels like. Not because it changes the past. Not because it fixes anything. But because understanding often arrives only after consequences. I opened Facebook Marketplace, created a listing, MacBook Pro, excellent condition, $200, cash only, The price looked absurd. That was the point. Within minutes, my phone exploded with messages. One person thought it was a scam. Another asked if I had accidentally forgotten a zero. A college student offered immediate pickup. I agreed. 40 minutes later, he was standing outside my apartment. The poor guy looked nervous, probably expecting something to be wrong. I handed him the laptop. He handed me 10 $20 bills. We completed the transaction in less than 2 minutes. As he walked away, he looked back twice, like he couldn't believe his luck. I understood the feeling. A year earlier, that had been me opening a lottery email for a limited edition PlayStation. Life has strange symmetry sometimes. I drove directly to the county animal shelter afterward. The volunteer behind the desk was friendly. Kind eyes, warm smile. The kind of person who probably believed the best about everyone. I donated the entire $200. In Mason's name, the volunteer thanked me, explained the donation would help cover medical treatment and supplies for rescued animals. Then she asked whether Mason would like a thank you card mailed to him. I smiled. Absolutely. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Not happy, not victorious, just peaceful. Because for the first time since the PlayStation disappeared, I felt like I understood exactly what came next. The relationship wasn't broken because of a console. The console had simply revealed the crack that was already there. And very soon, Mason was going to discover exactly how deep that crack really was. When Mason came home that afternoon, I was sitting on the couch with a book open in my lap. I wasn't reading. I had been staring at the same page for almost 20 minutes. Outside, the sky was turning gold with late afternoon sunlight. Cars moved through the parking lot below. Somewhere in another apartment, someone was laughing loudly at a television show. The world kept moving exactly the same way it always had. It was strange how ordinary everything looked when a relationship was quietly dying. I heard Mason's keys. Then the door opened. He walked inside carrying shopping bags, talking on speakerphone with his sister, laughing about something. For a few seconds, I simply watched him. Watched the ease in his expression, the confidence, the assumption that everything was fine. That assumption disappeared about 3 minutes later. I heard a drawer open in the kitchen, then another. Then footsteps, fast footsteps, the kind people make when confusion is beginning to turn into panic. He appeared in the living room. His face had gone pale. Lara, I looked up calmly. Yeah? Where's my MacBook? The question hung between us. A week earlier, I probably would have felt nervous. Maybe guilty, maybe uncertain. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like I was watching a movie whose ending I already knew. Oh, I said. I sold it. For a second, he genuinely stopped moving. Not slowed down. Stopped. His brain seemed unable to process what I'd just said. You what? I closed the book. I sold it this morning. The color drained from his face. His eyes widened. The shopping bag slipped slightly from his hands. You sold my laptop? I nodded. Got $200 for it. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The look on his face reminded me of exactly how I had felt standing in front of the empty entertainment center. Shock first, then disbelief, then the slow realization that reality wasn't going to change no matter how badly you wanted it to. What the hell are you talking about? I leaned back. Afterward, I donated the money to the county animal shelter. His jaw tightened. I could almost hear his pulse. They're sending you a thank you card. The silence that followed was almost impressive. Then it happened. The explosion. Are you out of your mind? His voice echoed through the apartment, not raised, not angry, furious. The kind of fury that comes from someone who never expected consequences to arrive at their own front door. That laptop cost almost $3,000. I nodded thoughtfully. It's not worth $3,000. His eyes narrowed. What? It's basically a Netflix machine. The moment the words left my mouth, I saw recognition flash across his face. Not understanding. Recognition. Because he knew exactly where those words came from, I continued quietly. And honestly, Mason, you're 30 years old. Maybe you could use a little digital detox. This is probably good for you. His face twisted. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked completely speechless. There are moments when people finally hear themselves. Not through memory, not through reflection, but through another person's voice. Sometimes that's the only mirror strong enough. That's not the same thing. His voice sounded hoarse. The irony wasn't lost on me. Not because it was funny. Because that sentence appears in almost every conflict where someone discovers they don't like being treated the way they've treated others. It's different. Different. That word again. Everything was always different when it happened to him. Giving away my property had been generosity. Selling his property was cruelty. His feelings mattered. Mine were overreactions. His judgment was wisdom. Mine was immaturity. The pattern suddenly looked so obvious, I couldn't believe I had spent over a year missing it. I stood slowly. No, my voice remained calm. It isn't different. Lara? No, Mason. I shook my head. My PlayStation was rare. Yours wasn't. My PlayStation can't be replaced with a quick trip to a store. Yours can. My PlayStation meant something to me. You knew that. I paused. But none of that is actually the point. His breathing was heavy now. The anger hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply lost control of the conversation. The point, I continued, is that you decided you had the right to choose what mattered in my life. His eyes dropped briefly. Only briefly. Then they came back up, defensive again. Looking at Mason, I realized guilt wasn't changing anything. It doesn't. Not immediately. Most people defend themselves first. Reflection comes later, if it comes at all. You were being ridiculous about a video game. The words came out quickly, almost desperate, like he was trying to rebuild a position he could already feel collapsing. I stared at him. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my mind since yesterday. Would you have asked me before giving away your watch? His eyes flickered. What? The watch your father gave you. He touched his wrist automatically. A habit. A reflex. That's different. There it is again? I smiled sadly. Different. I looked away. For the first time, I thought I saw uncertainty. Just a glimpse. Gone almost immediately. But it was there. And once you see a crack, it's impossible to completely unsee it. A lot of people think relationships end during the biggest fight. The screaming match. The betrayal. The dramatic confession. In my experience, relationships usually end much earlier. The fight simply reveals the death that already happened. Standing there, looking at Mason, I realized I wasn't trying to save anything anymore. That feeling surprised me, because I had loved him. I really had. Love doesn't disappear because someone hurts you. That would actually be easier. Love lingers. It stays long after trust leaves. Long after respect leaves. Long after the future you imagined starts falling apart. That's what makes breakups painful. You're not just losing a person. You're losing the version of tomorrow you built around them. Mason suddenly grabbed at his phone. I'm calling my sister. I nodded. Okay. I'm calling the police too. Okay. His head snapped up. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? His frustration deepened, because anger wants resistance. Anger wants an opponent. I wasn't giving him one. The truth was I felt strangely tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like I had spent months carrying something heavy without realizing it. And now that I had finally put it down, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt lighter. The police arrived about an hour later. The officer looked exhausted before he even entered the apartment. Middle-aged, tired eyes. Coffee stain on his uniform. The face of a man who had probably spent decades watching adults create problems they could have avoided with one honest conversation. He listened to Mason first, then me. Asked a few questions. Took notes. Looked around. Then sighed. A very long sigh. The kind of sigh that suggested he already knew exactly how this was going to end. You both touched property that wasn't yours. Neither of us spoke. This is likely a civil issue. Another pause. If either party wants compensation, small claims court exists for a reason. Then he looked at us. Really looked at us. Two adults arguing about electronics while standing in a perfectly nice apartment. His expression seemed to say something he was too professional to say aloud. Namely, you two should not be together. A few minutes later, he left. The apartment felt even quieter afterward. Mason packed a bag that evening. Not all of his things. Just enough for a few days. As he moved around the bedroom, folding clothes into a suitcase, I sat in the living room and listened. Neither of us spoke much. The silence wasn't angry anymore. It was something sadder. Final. When he reached the door, he stopped. For a second, I thought he might apologize. Or maybe I thought I wanted him to. Instead, he said, I can't believe you'd do this to me. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered honestly. I felt exactly the same way. His face hardened. Then he left. The door closed behind him. And for the first time in 14 months, I was alone in my apartment. The strange thing was that I expected loneliness. Instead, what arrived first was peace. Not happiness. Not relief. A strange sense of relief settled over me. A small, quiet space inside me that hadn't existed for a very long time. I sat there for nearly an hour without moving, watching sunlight disappear from the windows, watching evening settle across the room, thinking about how often people mistake criticism for honesty, control for concern, disrespect for love. The most dangerous relationships are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the relationships that slowly convince you to defend your own existence, to explain your hobbies, justify your interests, earn permission to enjoy your life. And once that starts happening, the relationship is already asking for too much. 6 days passed. The texts started almost immediately. At first they were angry, then demanding, then accusing. By the end of the week, Mason's entire family had joined the war, and that was when things became far uglier than either of us expected. The first few days after Mason left felt strangely unreal. Not because I missed him. At least not in the way people imagine. I missed habits. I missed routines. I missed reaching for my phone after work and instinctively thinking about someone before remembering that person was now actively trying to make my life difficult. There is a difference. What I missed wasn't Mason himself. It was the routine that had grown around him. Sometimes what hurts isn't losing the person. It's losing the version of your day that existed around them. For a while, every room in the apartment felt slightly off balance. His coffee mug was still in the cabinet. His favorite blanket was still folded on the couch. His jacket was still hanging beside the front door. Little reminders that a life had existed here. A life that was now slowly unraveling. The messages started the morning after he left. At first, they were exactly what I expected. Angry, emotional, accusatory, long paragraphs explaining why I had crossed a line, why I had embarrassed him, why I owed him money, why everyone agreed I was wrong. I read every message once, then stopped responding. Not because I was trying to punish him, because I was beginning to understand something important. Not every accusation deserves a defense. When someone has already decided you're the villain, explanations become performances. You're not having a conversation anymore. You're auditioning for forgiveness, and I had no interest in doing that. Still, one message caught my attention. It arrived late Tuesday evening. 3 paragraphs. The first 2 were anger. The third was a demand. Either return the MacBook or pay him $2,800. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed a single response. Return my PS5 or pay me $2,000. Then we'll talk. His answer came less than a minute later. I can't return it. Noah has it. He's been using it all week. I read the message twice, then laughed quietly. Not because it was funny, because of how predictable it was. Consequences always become complicated once they're personal. When Mason gave away my console, he expected me to absorb the loss. When he lost something, suddenly circumstances mattered. Suddenly there were reasons, explanations, nuances. I replied, the college student who bought your MacBook has probably been using it all week too. Funny how that works. There was a long pause. Then another message appeared. You're impossible. I looked at the words, then set the phone down. The truth was I wasn't being impossible. I was being consistent. Mason didn't hate my logic. He hated seeing it applied to him. Wednesday brought a new surprise. A knock at my door. 7 in the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I found Mason's brother-in-law standing outside. I'd met him a handful of times over the past year. Large man, broad shoulders, construction worker, the kind of person who naturally occupied more space than necessary. Not rude exactly, just accustomed to being physically intimidating. The moment I saw him, I knew this wasn't a social visit. We need to talk. I almost smiled. Nobody ever says those words when they're bringing good news. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. What about? His expression hardened. What you did to Mason. There it was. Not what we did. Not what happened. What I did. Interesting. I folded my arms. What exactly did I do? His jaw tightened. You humiliated him. I waited. Okay. You sold his property. I nodded. True. You made him cry. That one almost caught me off guard. Not because I didn't believe it. Because I suddenly remembered standing in my living room, staring at an empty entertainment center while Mason explained why losing my property was somehow good for me. Funny how nobody had shown up to advocate for my feelings that day. I looked at him. Did Mason explain how we got here? Hy told me enough. There are few phrases more dangerous than those 3 words. Enough. Enough usually means a carefully edited version. Enough means information filtered through loyalty. Enough means someone already chose a side before learning the facts. I nodded slowly. Did he mention he gave away my PlayStation without asking? He said it was just some game system. There it was. Again, just. I'd noticed that pattern before. Anything important to me somehow became smaller whenever Mason described it. It's just a game. Just a hobby. Just a joke. Just a mistake. The word itself isn't the problem. The problem is what often hides behind it. Disrespect. I looked him directly in the eye. It wasn't just a game system. Then I explained. The lottery, the limited edition, the saving, the rarity, the value. The fact that Mason never asked, never apologized, never even admitted he'd done anything wrong. The brother-in-law listened, but I could see it wasn't changing much, because facts are often powerless against family loyalty. When people love someone, they don't always want truth. Sometimes they want confirmation. He stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to make the intention obvious. Mason deserves compensation. I almost laughed. Not because he sounded scary, because the entire conversation had become absurd. Nobody was demanding compensation when I lost my property. Only after Mason experienced the same thing. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. I shook my head. No. His eyes narrowed. No, no. The hallway grew quiet. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that told me exactly what kind of situation this had become. You're going to regret this. I stared at him. The moment he stopped explaining and started threatening, I knew the conversation was over. The difference matters. Eventually, he walked away. The elevator doors closed. The conversation ended, but the feeling lingered. I went back inside, locked the door, and stood in the middle of my apartment for a long time, thinking. Not about Mason, not about the laptop, not even about the PlayStation. I was thinking about families, about loyalty, about how easily loyalty can become blindness. A healthy family tells you when you're wrong. An unhealthy family teaches you how to justify it. Thursday proved that theory, because the next person who arrived wasn't Mason. It was his mother, and unlike the brother-in-law, she wasn't interested in listening at all. Mason's mother arrived the next afternoon without calling. That detail mattered more than it might seem, because people who respect boundaries usually knock before entering your life. People who believe they are entitled to control the situation often skip that step entirely. I was working from home when I heard a knock at the door. Before I could get up from my desk, the handle turned. The door swung open. Marlene stepped inside as if the apartment belonged to her. No greeting, no apology, no hesitation, just purpose. The kind of purpose people develop when they've spent several days convincing themselves they're the hero. I stood from my desk. Marlene, her expression didn't change. We need to talk. I remember looking at her and suddenly realizing where Mason had learned it. That certainty. That absolute confidence that his judgment should outweigh everyone else's. It wasn't new. It was inherited. Some habits travel through families the same way eye color does. She walked farther into the apartment before speaking again. You've created a disaster. I folded my arms. Interesting choice of words. Her eyes narrowed. My grandson is terrified. I blinked. What? He thinks somebody is going to take the PlayStation away. For several seconds, I honestly didn't know how to respond. Not because I lacked an answer, because I was trying to understand how we had arrived here. A conversation that started with a stolen console had somehow transformed into me being blamed for a child's anxiety. The mental gymnastics were impressive. I have never threatened your grandson. That's not the point. I almost smiled. People say that phrase when they're losing the original argument. The point had always been the point. They just didn't like it anymore. I walked toward the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Not because I was thirsty, because I needed a second to stop myself from saying something unhelpful. When I turned back toward her, she was still standing there waiting, watching, judging, expecting. I suddenly remembered something my grandmother used to tell me. People who always need someone else to be wrong usually can't survive being questioned. At the time, I thought it was one of those old sayings grandparents collect throughout life. Now I understood exactly what she meant. Marlene, I said calmly, let me ask you something. She didn't answer. Would you be okay if I walked into your house tomorrow, took your jewelry, gave it away to someone else, and then told you it was good for you because you didn't need it anymore? Her face hardened immediately. That's completely different. The answer didn't surprise me. Everyone seemed to have a reason when it happened to someone else. Very few people had one when it happened to them. The kind of logic that always seemed to benefit the person using it. I nodded slowly. Silence, not agreement. Just silence. The distinction mattered. She didn't answer right away. I could almost see her searching for a response that would put the blame back on me. Eventually, she found one. You care more about that game than you cared about Mason. The statement hung in the air. Heavy. Accusatory. Designed to hurt. A year earlier, it probably would have. Now it mostly made me sad, because it revealed how little she understood. The issue had never been the PlayStation. Not really. The PlayStation was evidence. The actual problem was respect. Ownership. Autonomy. The basic expectation that the person you love doesn't get to decide which parts of you deserve to exist. I looked around my apartment. My apartment. That thought suddenly felt important, because over the last year, I had slowly started shrinking pieces of myself to make Mason more comfortable. Not dramatically, not enough to notice at first. Small things. Watching what I talked about, avoiding certain topics, downplaying excitement, explaining hobbies, defending interests. It happens so gradually that you don't see it while it's happening. Then one day you wake up and realize you've been asking permission to be yourself. That realization hit harder than losing the console ever did. Marlene continued talking, accusing, defending, rewriting. The details barely mattered anymore, because I had finally recognized the pattern underneath them. No matter what happened, Mason was never going to be responsible. Somebody else would always carry that burden. The circumstances, the misunderstanding, the victim, anyone except him. Eventually she left. Not because we reached understanding. Because she realized she wasn't getting what she came for. No apology. No concession. No admission. Just frustration. As the door closed behind her, the apartment became quiet again. The kind of stillness that forces you to sit alone with your thoughts. The kind of quiet that allows thoughts to catch up. I stood there for several minutes afterward, thinking about how relationships don't collapse from a single moment. They collapse from accumulated evidence. One disappointment, then another, until eventually the weight becomes impossible to carry. Friday afternoon brought another surprise. This one from Mason himself. I came home from work and found several cardboard boxes stacked outside my apartment door. For a second, I thought they had been delivered by mistake. Then I recognized my gaming headset sitting on top. My stomach sank. I opened the first box. More gaming equipment, collectibles, graphic novels, old merchandise from games I loved, personal items, nothing valuable financially, only emotionally. That detail wasn't accidental. Mason had chosen carefully. Hun hadn't removed expensive things. He'd removed meaningful things. A note sat on top. Handwritten. 3 short sentences. You obviously care more about toys than people. Maybe you should keep all of these too. Good luck. I read it twice, then folded it slowly. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry. A month earlier, I probably would have. Now I mostly felt tired, because the note wasn't really about the items. It was about punishment. Mason wanted me to feel ashamed of what I enjoyed, ashamed of who I was, ashamed of refusing to become the version of myself he preferred. And suddenly I understood something that should have been obvious much sooner. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. Love should never require you to shrink parts of yourself. They don't need you to abandon pieces of yourself so they can feel comfortable. The right person may not share your interests, but they won't treat them like character flaws. I carried the boxes inside, one by one, slowly, as evening settled outside the windows. When I finished, I looked around the apartment, at the scattered belongings, at the empty spaces, at the life that was ending. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether the relationship could be saved. Because some questions stop being important once you understand the answer. The better question was no longer whether Mason would change. The better question was why I had spent so long hoping he would. That night I called a locksmith. 2 hours later, every lock on the apartment had been changed. It cost me more money than I wanted to spend. But as I locked the door before going to bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Safe. Not because of the locks. Because I had finally stopped leaving the door open for people who didn't respect me. Meanwhile, cracks were beginning to appear somewhere else. Inside Mason's own family. Because the next person who called me wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, wasn't demanding anything. It was his sister. And for the first time since all of this began, someone was finally willing to hear the entire story. Mason's sister called me on Sunday afternoon. I almost didn't answer. By that point, every interaction with his family felt like stepping into the middle of an argument that had started before I arrived. But something about the voicemail she left sounded different. There was no anger, no accusation, no demand. Just a simple request. Elara, I'd like to hear your side. Your side, not your excuse, not your justification. Your side. The distinction mattered, more than most people realize. Because when conflict happens, many people don't actually seek understanding. They seek confirmation. They ask questions, hoping you'll validate the conclusion they've already reached. Very few people are willing to risk discovering they were wrong. I called her back. For almost an hour, we talked. Really talked. Not the way people talk during arguments. The way people talk when they're genuinely trying to understand something. I told her everything. The lottery. The saving, the limited edition, the conversations with Mason, the comments about gaming, the dismissal, the fact that he never apologized, the fact that he genuinely believed he was helping me. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Not hostile silence, thinking silence. The kind that arrives when a person's understanding of a situation begins shifting beneath their feet. Finally, she spoke. He told us it was just a PlayStation. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because somehow that sentence summarized the entire relationship. Mason always had a way of reducing things until they sounded insignificant. A PlayStation became just a console. A hobby became wasted time. A criticism became honesty. A bad decision became help. Looking back, that pattern explained more than any argument ever could. There is an interesting thing about the word just. It has the power to erase meaning. People place it in front of something important, and suddenly they expect the importance to disappear. But meaning doesn't work that way. A wedding ring is just a ring. A photograph is just paper. A letter is just ink. until it isn't. Until it represents something larger. The issue was never plastic and electronics. The issue was what Mason's decision revealed. His sister listened quietly. Then she asked a question nobody else had bothered asking. If it had been a regular $500 PlayStation, would you still be upset? I answered immediately. Yes, because I already knew the truth. It had never been about the money. It wasn't even about how rare the console was. What stayed with me was the fact that somebody who claimed to love me never thought my opinion was necessary. More than anything else, I hated feeling like a child in my own relationship. Another long silence followed. Then she sighed, a tired sigh. The kind people make when reality becomes inconvenient. I don't think he understands that. No, I looked out the apartment window. I don't think he does either. When the call ended, I felt strangely lighter. Not because she agreed with me, because for the first time, someone had listened. Genuinely listened. Sometimes validation isn't hearing that you're right. It's hearing that somebody finally understands what you've been trying to say. A week later, things changed quickly. The legal letter arrived first. Official envelope. Attorney letterhead. Very dramatic. It demanded payment for the MacBook. Threatened legal action. Listed damages. The whole performance. I read it twice, then laughed. Not because it wasn't serious. Because it completely ignored the obvious problem. You cannot walk into court demanding compensation for property when your own actions created the exact same situation. My friend helped me draft a response. Professional, documented, simple. We included everything. Purchase receipts, lottery confirmation, market value estimates, screenshots, timelines, evidence. Facts have a quiet confidence that emotional arguments never possess. They don't need volume. They simply exist. The response essentially said, if Mason wishes to pursue compensation regarding the laptop, I will pursue compensation regarding the PlayStation. A judge can decide. A few days later, the legal threat disappeared. No lawsuit. No follow-up. Nothing. Apparently, reality had finally entered the conversation. I wish that had been the end. It wasn't, because when legal pressure failed, public pressure arrived. Mason's mother wrote a long Facebook post. According to her version of events, I was emotionally abusive, vindictive, controlling, immature. Apparently, I had destroyed her son's life over a video game. Conveniently, the post omitted the part where Mason gave away my property first. Funny how selective memory becomes during family conflicts. I wasn't planning to respond. Honestly, I barely use Facebook anymore. But then something unexpected happened. One of Mason's cousins reached out privately. A woman I'd never even met. Her message was short. I feel like I'm not getting the whole story. That sentence alone made me trust her more than almost anyone else involved. Because curiosity is often a sign of fairness. The people most willing to listen are usually the ones willing to admit they might be missing something. So I sent her everything. The receipts, the screenshots, the timeline, the full story. A few hours later, she replied. Then she did something nobody expected. She publicly commented beneath Mason's mother's post. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just honestly. Turns out Mason gave away her limited edition PlayStation first without permission. Maybe tell the entire story. The post disappeared within the hour. And just like that, the public campaign ended. Truth doesn't always win, but lies become much harder to maintain once evidence arrives. Then came the part I never expected. Mason showed up, alone, no family, no lawyer, no anger. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. He looked exhausted. Like somebody who had spent weeks fighting a battle and finally realized he wasn't winning. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked if we could talk. Against my better judgment, I let him in. The conversation lasted almost an hour. And throughout that entire hour, one thing became painfully clear. Mason still didn't understand. Not completely. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged poor decisions, accepted some responsibility. But underneath everything, he still believed his intentions should matter more than his actions. That belief sat at the center of everything. Mason still believed his intentions mattered more than the damage he caused. They don't. If someone steps on your foot accidentally, the pain still exists. Intent explains behavior. It doesn't erase impact. Eventually, Mason looked at me, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Maybe we could start over. The sentence broke my heart. Not because I wanted to say yes. Because months earlier, I probably would have. Months earlier, I would have searched for reasons, compromises, possibilities, hope. But something had changed. I finally understood that love and compatibility are not the same thing. You can love someone deeply and still recognize they are wrong for you. You can care about someone and still choose not to build a future with them. Those truths can exist together. I don't think we can. The words hurt, even though I knew they were true. He looked down, nodded slowly. Part of him already knew. The rest of his belongings were collected the following weekend. His sister came to help. The process took a few hours. Boxes, furniture, books, clothes, the ordinary remains of a relationship. When everything was loaded into the SUV, his sister pulled me aside. There is one thing. I waited. Noah still has the PlayStation. I smiled faintly. I know. We tried convincing Mason to ask for it back. I shook my head. Don't. She blinked. What? Leave it alone. Her expression shifted. Confusion first, then surprise, then understanding. My problem was never Noah, and it was true. Children often become collateral damage in adult mistakes. I had no interest in being another adult who made that worse. The kid hadn't stolen anything. I hadn't manipulated anyone. I simply received a gift from people who should have known better. So I let it go. Not because it was fair, because some battles stopped being worth fighting. Eventually they drove away. The apartment felt larger after she left. For the first time in weeks, nothing felt tense. The storm had finally moved on. Weeks later, I rearranged the furniture, bought a plant, hung artwork I liked, connected my old PS4, started gaming with my friends again. One evening, while laughing through an online session, I realized something surprising. I hadn't thought about Mason all day. I kept waiting for some big moment when I would finally feel over everything. It never came. Instead, one day I realized I hadn't thought about Mason for several hours. A few days later, it was an entire afternoon. Then an entire day. That's when I knew I was finally moving forward. The final strange chapter arrived through the mail. An envelope from the animal shelter. Inside was a thank you card addressed to Mason. The donation I made in his name had helped pay medical expenses for a rescued dog. The card included a picture. One floppy ear, one upright ear, ridiculously happy face. His name was Biscuit. I stared at the photo for a long time, then laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. I took a picture and sent it to Mason. No explanation. Just the photo. His response arrived 2 minutes later. You're such an ass. I smiled, then typed my final message. His name was Biscuit. He found a family. You're welcome. A few seconds later, I was blocked. Honestly, it felt like the perfect ending. Not because I won. Not because Mason lost. Because sometimes the real victory isn't getting revenge. It's reclaiming yourself. The PlayStation was gone. The relationship was gone. The future I once imagined was gone. And somehow, after everything, I was okay. Maybe better than okay, because I finally understood something I wish I'd understood much earlier. Looking back, I don't think I was asking for very much. I never needed Mason to love gaming. I never needed him to play with me. I only needed him to respect the fact that it mattered to me. Somewhere along the way, that respect disappeared. Everything else disappeared after it. Maybe Mason still believes this story was about a PlayStation. I know it wasn't. The console was only the moment that revealed what had already been happening for a very long time. By then, the relationship was already over. Neither of us had admitted it yet.